So today we have another lecture I recorded quite a while ago, so ignore the dates and anything I mentioned about Tuesdays and Thursdays, since it was recorded in the spring of 2016. Once that lecture is over, I'll come back and discuss the material that was not covered in that original lecture. So that lecture was all about energy. To sort of help facilitate jumping into Tuesday's lecture, I want to get a little bit of a head start. And we're going to talk about how energy is used in the cell. And this covers roughly chapters 6.1 to 6.6 in the book. And again, the big picture is that cells and organisms need to utilize energy. And again, there are two major forms to utilize energy. They come in the form of cellular respiration and photosynthesis. And so I want to introduce this idea that energy ultimately comes from the sun. We'll talk a lot about this when we get to ecology at the end of the semester. But as you can imagine, plants photosynthesize. So they take in energy. They produce sugar molecules or organic molecules, as well as oxygen. And of course, animals like a cow like to eat plants, so they'll take in that energy from the plant, so they'll eat all those sugar molecules. Then, as you can imagine, we would then eat the cow, or humans would eat the cow in the form of a hamburger or a cheeseburger. So all the energy that's coming from the sun is converted into organic molecules by the plants, and this energy is essentially shuffled to cows, to hamburgers. Of course, if you're a vegetarian, you may eat a plant like lettuce or other leafy greens, and that's how we take in energy from the sun. So we take in energy that the plant has essentially utilized. So now that we've taken in energy, we need to actually convert it to ATP. And to do this, we have to breathe. So it actually turns out that the reaction to produce ATP relies on oxygen. So we take in oxygen via breathing in lungs. This gets transported throughout our bloodstream into the cells utilizing glucose molecules. So something like a muscle cell or muscle fibers are going to utilize lots of oxygen and lots of glucose to do cellular respiration. Looking again at this reaction down here, glucose plus oxygen creates carbon dioxide, which is a waste product of cellular respiration. So as you know, that gets transported throughout our bloodstream and gets released outside of our lungs. So oxygen comes in, reacts with glucose in cells doing cellular respiration. Those cells then produce the waste product known as carbon dioxide, which is released out through our lungs. So in goes oxygen, out goes carbon dioxide. And of course, the big reason why we're doing this is to produce ATP, or energy, for our cells. So let's talk a little about exercise and ATP. So as I've sort of alluded to, we burn ATP when we exercise. And of course, this creates a need for further ATP, which is why our cells go through cellular respiration more when we're exercising. So of course, most people don't use ATP as a measurement for how much they've been exercising. We usually use calories to account for energy. And just sort of an aside, a calorie is actually a kilocalorie. So if you're ever doing more advanced nutrition or chemistry, know that a calorie is not actually a calorie. So to burn 1 kilocalorie of food, you would actually need to burn 3 times 10 to the 22 ATP molecules. So if you ever have done scientific notation, you know that 10 to the 22 is an insane amount of ATP. So I've written out the actual number, and you can see that it's many, many zeros long. So just to burn 1 kilocalorie of food, you need to burn a huge number of ATP molecules, which is probably one reason why we don't actually use ATP to account for energy. And so essentially the big idea of this is that your cells are producing a ton of ATP, more than you could possibly imagine. And you can imagine that we're burning an insane amount of ATP while we're exercising as well. So now let's go back to talking about cellular respiration. So again, how your body produces more ATP for exercise and other forms of work. So cellular respiration essentially attempts to extract energy from molecules. So again, attempting to extract energy from exergonic reactions to drive an endergonic reaction, one such as producing ATP. And the most important molecule that cellular respiration uses is glucose. And as you can imagine, this process happens slowly over time. So whereas an exergonic reaction like TNT happens very quickly and creates an explosion, the cell doesn't want that to happen. It wants energy to be really slowly over time so that not too much heat or other detrimental chemicals are produced and kill the cell. So essentially cellular respiration is a slow process. And so here's the overall reaction of cellular respiration. So again, I said glucose was a very important molecule. It's one of the major reactions of cellular respiration. But again, remember I also said we have to breathe in oxygen. So glucose plus oxygen are the two major reactants. The products are carbon dioxide, water, of course, the molecule we actually want, ATP, and heat. And so the textbook has done a very nice job of drawing out this reaction. They put a lot of arrows here. And so how this relates to the last chapter is that it actually turns out that all of these reactions here are enzyme driven. So there are many reactions in here in cellular respiration, and all of these are driven by enzymes, or else they would just never happen because these molecules right here would never be able to jump over their activation energy barrier. So the cell is actually able to capture energy from glucose and oxygen through redox reactions. So redox reactions are essentially reactions where there are movement of electrons from one molecule to another. Redox is short for oxidation reduction, or in this case it should be actually flipped. It should be reduction oxidation reactions. However, in short, you just refer to them as redox reactions. So when you have loss of an electron or hydrogen from one substance, we call that oxidation. When you have an addition of electrons or hydrogen, we call this a reduction reaction. So again, we have movement of electrons. When you lose those electrons, or they move away from you, we call it oxidation. When they move towards you or you gain them, we call that a reduction. An easy way to remember this is through this little phrase right here. Leo goes ger, so lose electrons oxidized, gain electrons reduced. So as I've said, cellular respiration is a redox reaction or reduction oxidation reaction. So in this case, glucose becomes oxidized or loses electrons. It gets oxidized into the form of carbon dioxide. And on the flip side of that, we have oxygen, or O2, gaining electrons and being reduced to water. So here we have an oxidation reaction, and here we have a reduction reaction. And this happens through the process of cellular respiration. Looking at a little bit more of a zoomed in picture, here we have a 3-carbon molecule that's very common in cellular respiration. That becomes oxidized and loses some electrons. We then have a molecule called NAD+, pick up those electrons. So again, we have this 3-carbon molecule here being oxidized, and we have something here being reduced. In this case, NAD+ gains electrons and is reduced to NADH. So again, this is a redox reaction. We have something being oxidized, something being reduced. And you guys will become very familiar with these molecules on this slide once we start learning more about cellular respiration. And so here's a very nice picture or diagram that shows the whole entire process of cellular respiration. So again, there are 3 major parts. glycolysis, which is the first step. Next, the citric acid cycle. And last, oxidative phosphorylation. And so really the point of doing this whole entire process again is to generate ATP for the cell. So essentially generating energy for the cell to do work and for the human body to actually function and live. So here we're going to start the new section of this lecture with a question. So this is question number 3. The first 2 questions you can find on Blackboard under the lecture worksheet. So question number 3, what is the name of the process used to turn organic matter into ATP? So hopefully that wasn't too challenging of a question since we've gone over this material a couple times now. So the correct answer here is B, cellular respiration. So that's all about going from organic matter into ATP. And here's a different way of looking at cellular respiration. So this is a nice figure from your book. So as you can see, cellular respiration is all about going from glucose plus oxygen to carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. As a byproduct, we generate heat from this process. And again, another reminder, so we want lots of ATP since that's the energy currency of the cell. So as we saw in the previous figure, glucose is one of the major reactants of cellular respiration, along with oxygen. So glucose, as it says on the slide, is the main player in cellular respiration. Glucose, as you probably know, is a carbohydrate, so it's a sugar molecule. And a very important note is that the energy found in glucose is held in the electrons. So I'll say that one more time. The energy in glucose is held in the electrons. So it's all about utilizing the electrons as an energy source for cellular respiration. And we're going to see after the next couple of lectures why that's true. But just for now, know that the energy stored in glucose is found in the electrons. We also discussed redox reactions, so I won't go over the slide. Please note that there are now little red asterisks, and that's just to make a note of the fact that redox reactions are much more complex than what I'm teaching you right now. So if you take general chemistry, you'll find out that redox reactions are very, very important, and they're also very much more complex than what I'm showing you in the next few slides. So just be aware of that. For now, we'll use these simple general rules for the purposes of our biology class. There's also a reminder, so in cellular respiration, glucose becomes oxidized and oxygen becomes reduced. So glucose is oxidized because it loses electrons. Remember, glucose stores its energy in electrons. And then oxygen becomes reduced to water. So here's a slide I like very much. So it shows you where the various processes happen. So really there are 3 or 4 major processes in cellular respiration. The first one is glycolysis. The second, sometimes also second and third combined, is pyruvate oxidation and the citric acid cycle. So the citric acid cycle actually goes by many different names. Sometimes it's called the TCA cycle, sometimes it's called the Krebs cycle. So Krebs is actually the name of the guy that discovered the citric acid cycle. And then lastly, we have oxidative phosphorylation. So if you look at each of these boxes, you can see there are arrows pointing towards ATP. So in glycolysis, you have ATP formed. In the citric acid cycle, you have ATP formed. And in oxidative phosphorylation, you also have ATP formed. If you look at the relative sizes of each ATP molecule, or sort of explosion symbol, you can see that oxidative phosphorylation has the largest one. And that's because the majority of ATP is actually formed in oxidative phosphorylation. However, it's important to note that in glycolysis in the citric acid cycle, you also form a little bit of ATP. But again, the majority is formed in oxidative phosphorylation. The thing I also like about this diagram is it shows you where each of these processes take place. So glycolysis actually happens in the cytosol, and then pyruvate oxidation, the citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation all happen in the mitochondria. So again, remember going back to chapter 4, I believe, the mitochondria is all about generating ATP. And the site of oxidative phosphorylation in the citric acid cycle, as well as pyruvate oxidation, is the mitochondria. So that's why it's such an important organelle in energy generation. And so we actually have electron carriers. These are these things right here, NADH and FADH2. So as we're going to see, these two molecules are actually going to carry electrons from glucose and bring them towards the oxidative phosphorylation step of cellular respiration. So just be aware those two molecules are called electron carriers. more specifically NADH or FADH2. And we're going to see how they play a role in this whole entire process of cellular respiration in the next couple of slides and also the next lecture as well. So today we're actually going to focus on the process of glycolysis. So this is the first major step of cellular respiration. And it's all about going from glucose to this molecule called pyruvate. And this is a multi-step process, as alluded to by these arrows right here. So we're going to see the major steps that take place in glycolysis. We're also going to generate some electron carriers, as shown by the arrow. So we're actually going to be generating some NADH, as well as some ATP at this level. So the next slide, I'm going to show you an overall diagram of what glycolysis looks like. So here's the whole entire process of glycolysis. So again, this is the first of 3 or 4 major steps of cellular respiration. So as you can see, it's a very complex process, about 9 steps total. So a very long enzymatically driven process. So on this slide, this shows the whole entire process, and we're going to go over the major parts of it first. The next few slides after that, we're going to break it down and look at each molecule step by step. So again, the major reactant of cellular respiration is glucose. So here we start with one glucose molecule. You can see on the right-hand side, we have a nice little artistic interpretation of what glucose looks like. So as you may know, glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. So we have 6 black circles, each one representing a carbon molecule. At the very end of glycolysis, we end up with 2 molecules of what's called pyruvate. So pyruvate, as you can see, is a 3-carbon molecule, and we end up with 2 of those. So you can imagine we start with glucose, which is 6 carbons, and we essentially split it down the middle. So we split a 6-carbon molecule into 2 3-carbon molecules. And again, the name of that 3-carbon molecule is pyruvate. As far as the major parts of glycolysis goes, there are 2 major parts. There is the energy investment, or preparatory phase, and then there is the energy payoff phase. So the energy investment phase, as the name alludes to, requires ATP to be invested into the reaction. So glycolysis actually requires some amount of ATP. In the energy payoff phase, as you can imagine, you actually get ATP generated. So more specifically, in the energy investment phase, you invest 2 ATP molecules. In the energy payoff phase, you get back 4 ATP. So in glycolysis, you generate 2 ATP molecules total. So here now we're going to break down the process for glycolysis. So again, the first major reactant is glucose. So carbohydrate that we're starting with. Again, it's 6 carbons long, so you can see 6 black dots, each representing a carbon. So the first thing that happens with glucose is it gets phosphorylated. So you can see an ATP comes in, that ATP gives away one of its phosphate groups and is turned into ADP. Now we have glucose 6-phosphate formed. And again, you can see that phosphate group added to the 6 carbon molecules of glucose. We then have another ATP added, so that gives us a phosphate group, gets turned to ADP, and as we're going to see in the next slide, fructose 6-phosphate gets another phosphate group added to it. So again, this whole entire first half of glycolysis is called the energy investment phase. So as you can see, we've invested 2 ATP already into the process of glycolysis. So that's why it gets the name energy investment. So just as I said, we have a second ATP molecule added. Now we have a 6-carbon molecule with 1 phosphate group on each side. So I mentioned in the last couple of slides that the end product of glycolysis is pyruvate. So essentially we have 2 3-carbon molecules. So we start with a 6-carbon molecule, we end up with 2 3-carbon molecules. So essentially glucose is split right down the middle and we get 2 3-carbon molecules. So this is actually the step where we have fructose 1,6-bisphosphate split right down the middle, and we have glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate formed, or G3P. So again, we went from a 6-carbon molecule, we split it right down the middle, and we formed 2 3-carbon molecules. It's actually a little bit more complex of a process than this, as you could imagine, but essentially what we've done is we split it right down the middle. So splitting the 6-carbon molecule into 2 3-carbon molecules. You can also notice that on each side, we have each 3-carbon molecule with a phosphate group attached to it. So now each one of those 3-carbon molecules has one phosphate group. So now that we have this molecule split in half, so now we have 2 3-carbon molecules, you can imagine the rest of glycolysis happening twice. So if we go back to the summary slide, you can see that we split the molecule in half. So we have the process happening once, and we have it happening twice. So essentially, once you've split that molecule, the fructose 1,6-bisphosphate and a glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, now that process with glycolysis is going to happen twice, since you have 2 3-carbon molecules. So here's our first actual redox reaction. So remember, reduction is gaining electrons, oxidation is lost electrons. So here, our energy carrier molecule NAD+ is gaining electrons, so it's being reduced, and it's being reduced to NADH. So again, just as I said, remember, be very careful here. So glycolysis, after you split that glucose molecule in half, now you have the whole entire glycolysis process happening twice. So we actually have 2 NADH plus reduced to NADH. And that's again because you have 1, 2, 3-carbon molecules. While this process is happening, while you have this reduction of NAD+, you also have a phosphate group added. And again, that happens twice, once for each of the 2 3-carbon molecules. So now you have a 3-carbon molecule with phosphate groups on both sides. So this is 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Next, we have ADP converted to ATP. So remember, this is the energy payoff phase. So now we're actually going to get ATP back. So first, in the energy investment phase, we invested 2 ATP. Here we're going to get 4 ATP back for a net gain of 2 ATP. So here again, we have ADP turned into ATP. So that 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate gives up one of those phosphate groups. And now it's left with only one phosphate group on the one side. Again, this happens twice. So essentially in step 6 of glycolysis, we have 2 ATP molecules generated here. Step 7 and 8, you don't really need to know too much about that. Essentially a water molecule leaves. And then lastly, in step 9, we have 2 more ATP molecules generated here. So this phosphate group is given up, and this converts ADP into ATP. And lastly, we have our pyruvate at the very end. So remember, we start with glucose, 6 carbon molecules, and we end up with 2 molecules of pyruvate being a 3-carbon molecule. So essentially, we've generated 4 ATP here. And then if you subtract out the 2 ATP we gave away during the energy investment phase, we essentially get a net gain of 2 ATP. So through all this process of glycolysis, we've generated 2 ATP. Again, this is not a big deal. So remember, the majority of ATP is generated in oxidative phosphorylation, not in glycolysis and not in the citric acid cycle. So the majority is generated in oxidative phosphorylation. So we're going to see these NADH molecules or NADH electron carriers come back in that process of oxidative phosphorylation, and we're going to see why these electron carriers are so important in that process. So really, for exam purposes, I don't want you memorizing all the names of the molecules of glycolysis, nor do I want you to memorize all the enzymes involved. So really, I want you to know the major steps of glycolysis. And to help you study those, I listed out what I think are the most important things about the process of glycolysis. So again, the first half of glycolysis is the energy investment phase. So first, glucose is phosphorylated twice. So that invests 2 ATP into the process. So we have to give away 2 ATP, which are converted into ATP. Step 2, we have the 6-carbon molecule split into 2 3-carbon molecules. So that's our glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, or G3P. And each one has a phosphate. So on the end of the molecule, there's one phosphate group attached. After that, we start the payoff phase. So this is actually where we generate ATP, or essentially a net gain in ATP. Next, we have NAD+, which is reduced to NADH. During this process, phosphate is added. So each one of those 3 carbon molecules had a phosphate on one end. Now we have a second phosphate group added to each. Step 4, each of those 2 carbon molecules generates 2 ATP, for essentially 4 ATP total. So those are the major steps of glycolysis. And so I really don't want you to know much more than that. So essentially I want you to know the major steps and the major inputs and outputs of glycolysis. And here are some questions for you to ponder. So one of the best ways to study for an exam or something like that is to make a table or a list or what have you of the major inputs, the outputs, the major steps, whatever you think will help you on the exam. But again, I don't want you to memorize the names of enzymes and molecules and memorize every step of glycolysis. I want you to be aware of the major steps, the major inputs, and the major outputs. So not to be nitpicky and have you memorize everything there.